Okay, this is The Birth of the Clinic by Michel Foucault, chapter 2, called A Political Consciousness. Compared with the medicine of species, the notions of constitution, endemic disease, and epidemic were of only marginal importance in the 18th century. But we must return to Sydenham and to the ambiguity of what he has taught to teach us. In addition to being the initiator of classificatory thought, he defined what might be a historical and geographical consciousness of disease. Sydenham's constitution is not an autonomous nature, but the complex, a kind of temporary node of a set of natural events, qualities of soil, climate, seasons, rain, drought, centers of pestilence, famine, and when all these factors do not account for phenomena, there remains no clear species in the garden of disease, but an obscure nucleus, buried in the earth. Vare sunt semper annorum constitutione quae neque calori neque frigori non sicu humidov ortum sum debent, sed ab occulta potius inexplicabili quadam alternatione in ipsis terrae visceribus pendant. The constitutions hardly have symptoms of their own. They define by displacements of accent unexpected groups of signs, phenomena of a more intense or weaker kind. Fevers may be violent and dry. Catarrhs and serous discharges more frequent. During a long hot summer, visceral congestion is more common and more tenacious than usual. Of London between July and September 1661, Sydenham says, "Agri paroxysmus atrocior, lingua magis nigra, sicacu extra paroxysmum aporexia obscurio, verium e appetitus prostratio major item ad paroxysm proclinitas omnia summatum accidentia immanioria ipsicu morbus quam promor febrium intermittantium funestior." The Constitution is not related to a specific absolute of which it is the more or less modified manifestation. It is perceived solely in the relativity of differences, by a gaze that is in some sense diacritical. Not every constitution is an epidemic, but an epidemic is a finer-grained constitution with more constant, more homogeneous phenomena. There has been, and still is, a great deal of discussion as to whether the doctors of the 18th century had grasped its contagious character, and whether they had posed the problem of the agent of their transmission. An idle question, and one that remains alien, or at least derivative, in relation to the fundamental structure. An epidemic is more than a particular form of a disease. In the 18th century, it was an autonomous, coherent, and adequate evaluation of disease. One calls epidemic diseases all those that attack at the same time and with unalterable characteristics a large number of persons. There is no difference in nature or species. Therefore, between an individual disease and an epidemic phenomenon, it is enough that a sporadic malady may be reproduced a number of times for it to constitute an epidemic. It is a purely mathematical problem of the threshold. The sporadic disease is merely a submarginal epidemic. The perception involved is no longer essential and ordinal, as in the medicine of species, but quantitative and cardinal. The basis of this perception is not a specific type, but a nucleus of circumstances. The basis of an epidemic is not pestilence or catarrh. It is Marseille in 1721, or Bistre in 1780. It is Rouen in 1769, where there occurred during the summer an epidemic among the children of the nature of bilious, catarrhal, and putrid fevers, complicated by miliaria and ardent bilious fevers during the autumn. This constitution degenerated into putrid biliousness towards the end of that season, and during the winter of 1769 and 1770. The usual pathological forms are mentioned, but as factors in a complex set of intersections in which their role is analogous to that of the symptom in relation to the disease. Okay. Distilled water is the only clean water that you can get. And you can't buy it, you have to make your own. So. The essential basis is determined by the time, the place, the fresh, sharp, subtle, penetrating air of Nimes in winter, or the sticky, thick, putrid air of Paris during a long, heavy summer. The regularity of symptoms does not allow the wisdom of a natural order to show through as in filigree. It treats only the constancy of causes, the obstinacy of a factor whose total, unceasingly repeated pressure determines a preferential form of disease. It may be a cause that survives in time, being responsible, for example, for plica in Poland and scrofula in Spain, in which cases the term endemic will be more readily used, or it may be causes that suddenly attack a large number of people in one place without distinction of age, sex, or temperament. They appear to proceed from a single cause, but as these diseases reign only for a limited period, this cause may be regarded as purely accidental. This is so in the case of smallpox, malign fever, or dysentery, which are epidemics in the true sense. It is hardly surprising that despite the great diversity in disposition and age of the people affected, the disease shows the same symptoms in all. This is because dryness or humidity, heat or cold, when prolonged, ensure the domination of one of our constitutive principles, alkalis, salts, phlogiston. We are then exposed to the accidents occasioned by this principle, and these accidents must be the same for different subjects. The analysis of an epidemic does not involve the recognition of the general form of the disease by placing it in the abstract space of nosology, but the rediscovery beneath the general signs of the particular process, which varies according to circumstances from one epidemic to another, and which weaves from the cause to the morbid form a web common to all the sick, but peculiar to this moment in time and this place in space. In Paris, in 1785, there was an epidemic of quartan fever and putrid synocus. But the essence of the epidemic was that the bile had dried up in its passages and turned into melancholy. The blood had become impoverished, thickened, and sticky, as it were. The organs of the lower part of the abdomen had swollen and become the causes or centers of obstruction, or a sort of overall singularity, an individual with many similar heads, whose features are manifested only once in time and space. The specific disease is always more or less repeated. The epidemic is never quite repeated. In this perceptual structure, the problem of contagion is of little importance. Transmission from one individual to another is never the essence of an epidemic. It may, in the form of miasma or leaven, which can be communicated through water, food, contact, the wind, or confined air, constitute one of the causes of the epidemic, either direct or primary, when it is the sole operant cause, or secondary when in a town or hospital the miasma is the product of an epidemic disease caused by some other factor. But contagion is only one modality of the brute fact of the epidemic. It was readily admitted that malign diseases like plague had a transmittable cause. It was more difficult to recognize the same fact in the case of the simple epidemic diseases, whooping cough, measles, scarlet fever, bilious diarrhea, intermittent fever. Whether contagious or not, an epidemic has a sort of historical individuality. Hence, the need to employ a complex method of observation when dealing with it. Being a collective phenomenon, it requires a multiple gaze, a unique process. It must be described in terms of its special, accidental, unexpected qualities. The event must be described in detail, but it must also be described in accordance with the coherence implied by multi-perception. Being an imprecise form of knowledge, insecurely based while ever partial, incapable of acceding of itself to the essential or fundamental, it finds its own range only in the cross-checking of viewpoints, in repeated, corrected information, which finally circumscribes, where gazes meet, the individual, unique nucleus of these collective phenomena. At the end of the 18th century, this form of experience was being institutionalized. In each subdelegation, a physician and several surgeons were appointed by the intendant or provincial administrator to study those epidemics that might break out in their canton. They were in constant correspondence with the chief physician of the Généralité, Treasury subdivision of Old France, concerning both the reigning disease and the medicinal topography of their canton. And when 4 or 5 people succumbed to the same disease, the syndic had to notify the subdelegate, who sent the physician to prescribe the treatment to be administered daily by the surgeons. In more serious cases, the physician of the Généralité visited the scene of the outbreak himself. But this experience could achieve full significance only if it was supplemented by constant, constricting intervention. A medicine of epidemics could exist only if supplemented by a police to supervise the location of mines and cemeteries, to get as many corpses as possible cremated instead of buried, to control the sale of bread, wine, and meat, to supervise the running of abattoirs and dye works, and to prohibit unhealthy housing. After a detailed study of the whole country, a set of health regulations would have to be drawn up that would be read at service or mass every Sunday and holy day, and which would explain how one should feed and dress oneself, how to avoid illness, and how to prevent or cure prevailing diseases. These precepts would become like prayers that even the most ignorant, even children, would learn to recite. Lastly, a body of health inspectors would have to be set up that could be sent out to the provinces, placing each one in charge of a particular department. There he would collect information about the various domains related to medicine, as well as about physics, chemistry, natural history, topography, and astronomy, would prescribe the measures to be taken, and would supervise the work of the doctor. It is to be hoped that the state would provide for these physicians and spare them the expense that an inclination to make useful discoveries entails. A medicine of epidemics is opposed at every point to a medicine of classes, just as the collective perception of a phenomenon that is widespread but unique and unrepeatable may be opposed to the individual perception of the identity of an essence as constantly revealed in the multiplicity of phenomena. The analysis of a series in the one case, the decipherment of a type in the other, the integration of time in the case of epidemics, the determination of hierarchical place in the case of the species, the attribution of a causality, the search for an essential coherence, the subtle perception of a complex historical and geographical space, the demarcation of a homogeneous surface in which analogies can be read. And yet, in the final analysis, when it is a question of these tertiary figures that must distribute the disease, medical experience, and the doctor's supervision of social structures, the pathology of epidemics and that of the species are confronted by the same requirements. The definition of a political status for medicine and the constitution at state level of a medical consciousness whose constant task would be to provide information, supervision, and constraint, all of which relate as much to the police as to the field of medicine proper. This was the origin of the Société Royale de Médecins, and its insuperable conflict with the faculté. In 1776, the government decided to set up at Versailles a society for the study of the epidemic and epizootic phenomena that had increased considerably in recent years. The precise occasion was a disease affecting livestock that had broken out in southeastern France and which had forced the Contrôleur Général des Finances to order the killing off of all suspect animals. This led to a fairly serious disruption of the regional economy. The decree of 29 April 1776 declares in its preamble that epidemics are deadly and destructive at the outset only because their character, being little known, leaves the doctor in uncertainty as to the choice of treatment that should be applied. And this uncertainty arises because so little has been done to study the different treatments used or to describe the symptoms of the different epidemics and the curative methods that have been most successful. The commission was to have a threefold role: investigation, by keeping itself informed of the various epidemic movements; elaboration, by comparing facts, recording the treatments used, and organizing experiments; and supervision and prescription, by informing the medical practitioners of the methods that seem to be most suitable to a given situation. It was to be made up of 8 doctors, a directeur entrusted with the correspondence concerning epidemic and epizootic diseases, de la Sonne, a commissaire général who would coordinate the work of the provincial doctors, Vic d'Azir, and 6 doctors of the faculté, who would devote themselves to work on these same subjects. The Contrôleur des Finances could send them out to the provinces to make inquiries and ask them for reports. Lastly, Vic d'Azir was to give a course in human and comparative anatomy to the other members of the commission, the doctors of the faculté, and those students who showed themselves to be worthy of it. Thus, a double check was set up: that of the political authorities over the practice of medicine, and that of a privileged medical body over the practitioners as a whole. The conflict with the faculté broke out at once. In contemporary eyes, it was a collision of 2 institutions, one modern and politically supported, and the other archaic and inward-looking. A partisan of the faculty described their opposition thus: the one ancient, respectable for all manner of reasons, and principally in the eyes of the members of the society, most of whom have been trained by it; the other, a modern institution whose members have preferred to associate with ministers of the crown rather than with their own institutions, who have deserted the assemblies of the faculté to which the public good and their oaths should have kept them attached for a career of intrigue. For 3 months, the faculté went on strike in protest. It refused to exercise its functions, and its members refused to consult with the members of the society. But the outcome was determined in advance because the Conseil supported the new committee. By 1778, the letters patent confirming its transformation into the Société Royale de Médecins had been registered, and the faculté had been forbidden to employ any kind of defense in this affair. The Société received an income of 40,000 francs raised from mineral waters, while the faculté received hardly 2,000 francs. But above all, its role was constantly being enlarged. As a control body for epidemics, it gradually became a point for the centralization of knowledge and authority for the registration and judgment of all medical activity. At the beginning of the revolution, the Finance Committee of the National Assembly was to justify its status thus: the object of this society is to link French medicine with foreign medicine by means of a useful correspondence, to gather together isolated observations, to preserve them and to compare them, and above all, to research into the common cause of disease, to forecast their occurrence, and to discover the most effective remedies for them. The Société no longer consisted solely of doctors who devoted themselves to the study of collective pathological phenomena. It had become the official organ of a collective consciousness of pathological phenomena. A consciousness that operated at both the level of experience and the level of knowledge in the international as well as the national space. Political events had a certain novelty value here, as far as basic structures were concerned. A new type of experience was created whose general lines, formed around the years 1775 to 1780, were to extend far in time and bring with them, during the Revolution and right up to the Consulate, many projects of reform. No doubt very few of these plans were ever implemented. And yet, the form of the medical perception that they involve is one of the constituent elements of clinical experience. There was a new style of totalization. The treatises of the 18th century, institutions, aphorisms, nosologies, enclosed medical knowledge within a defined space. The table drawn up may not have been complete in every detail, and may have contained gaps here and there owing to ignorance, but in its general form, it was exhaustive and closed. It was now replaced by open, infinitely extendable tables. Hotirsik had already provided an example of such a table when, at Choiseul's request, he proposed a plan of collective work for military physicians and surgeons, comprising 4 parallel, unlimited series: the study of topographies, location, terrain, water, air, society, the temperaments of the inhabitants. Meteorological observations, pressure, temperature, winds, an analysis of epidemics and common diseases, and a description of extraordinary cases. The theme of the encyclopedia is replaced by that of constantly revised information, where it is a question rather of totalizing events and their determination than of enclosing knowledge in a systematic form. It is so true that there exists a chain linking throughout the universe, on earth and in man, all beings, all bodies, all affections, a chain whose subtlety eludes the superficial gaze of the meticulous experimenter and the writer of cold dissertations, but it is revealed to the truly observant genius. At the beginning of the revolution, Canton proposed that this work of information should be undertaken in each department by a commission elected from among the doctors. Matthew Giraud demanded the creation in every large town of a government health center, and in Paris of a health court, sitting beside the National Assembly, centralizing information, conveying it from one part of the country to another, discussing questions that still remain obscure, and indicating what research needs to be carried out. What now constituted the unity of the medical gaze was not the circle of knowledge in which it was achieved, but that open, infinite, moving totality, ceaselessly displaced and enriched by time, whose course it began but would never be able to stop. By this time, a clinical recording of the infinite, variable series of events, but its support was not the perception of the patient in his singularity, but a collective consciousness with all the information that intersects it, growing in a complex, ever-proliferating way until it finally achieves the dimensions of a history, a geography, a state. In the 18th century, the fundamental act of medical knowledge was the drawing up of a map. A symptom was situated within a disease in a specific ensemble, and this ensemble in a general plan of the pathological world. In the experience that was being constituted towards the end of the century, it was a question of carving up the field by means of the interplay of series, which, in intersecting one another, made it possible to reconstitute the chain referred to by Minuret. Each day, Razeau made meteorological and climatic observations, which he then compared with a nosological analysis of patients under observation and with the evolution, crisis, and outcome of the diseases. A system of coincidences then appeared that indicated a causal connection and also suggested kinships or new links between diseases. If anything is able to improve our art, Sauvage himself wrote to Razeau, It is work of this kind carried out over a period of 50 years by a team of 30 doctors as meticulous and industrious as yourself. I will do all in my power to have one of our doctors carry out the same observations in our Hotel Dieu. What defines the act of medical knowledge in its concrete form is not, therefore, the encounter between doctor and patient, nor is it the confrontation of a body of knowledge and a perception. It is the systematic intersection of two series of information, each homogeneous but alien to each other, two series that embrace an infinite set of separate events, but whose intersection reveals in its isolable dependence the individual fact, a sagittal figure of knowledge. In this movement, medical consciousness is duplicated. It lives at an immediate level in the order of savage observations, but it is taken up again at a higher level, where it recognizes the constitutions, confronts them, and turning back upon the spontaneous forms, dogmatically pronounces its judgment and its knowledge. It becomes centralized in structure. At the institutional level, this apparent in the Société Royale du Médecin. And at the beginning of the revolution, there were innumerable projects that schematized this dual and necessary authority of medical knowledge, with its ceaseless movement between these two levels, at the same time maintaining and traversing the distance between them. Mathieu Géraud proposed the setting up of a health court, tribunal de salubrité, where a prosecutor would denounce any person who, without having given proof of his ability, exercises upon another or upon an animal that does not belong to him anything pertaining to the direct or indirect application of the art of health. The decisions of this court concerning professional abuses, inadequacies, and imperfections should constitute the jurisprudence of the medical state. In addition to a judiciary, there should be an executive that would exercise a policing function over all aspects of health. La haute et grande police sur toutes les branches de salubrité. It would prescribe what books were to be read and what new works were to be written. It would indicate, on the basis of the information received, what treatment was to be administered for prevalent diseases. It would publish whatever was required by an enlightened medical practice, whether the results of inquiries carried out under its own supervision or foreign works. Following an autonomous movement, the medical gaze circulates within an enclosed space, in which it is controlled only by itself, in sovereign fashion. It distributes to daily experience the knowledge that it has borrowed from afar, and of which it has made itself both the point of concentration and the center of diffusion. In that experience, medical space can coincide with social space, or rather, traverse it and wholly penetrate it, one began to conceive of a generalized presence of doctors whose intersecting gazes form a network and exercise at every point in space and at every moment in time a constant, mobile, differentiated supervision. The problem of the settling of doctors in the countryside was raised. There were requests for a statistical supervision of health based on the registration of births and deaths, which would have to mention the disease from which the individual suffered, his mode of life, and the cause of his death, thus constituting a pathological record. There were demands that the reasons for exemption from military service on medical grounds should be given in detail by the recruiting board. In fact, that a medical topography of each department should be drawn up, with detailed observations concerning the region, housing, people, principal interests, dress, atmospheric constitution, produce of the ground, time of their perfect maturity and their harvesting, and physical and moral education of the inhabitants of the area. And since the question of the settling of doctors was not enough, the consciousness of each individual must be altered. Every citizen must be informed of what medical knowledge is necessary and possible, and each practitioner must supplement his supervisory activity with teaching. For the best way of avoiding the propagation of disease is to spread medical knowledge. The locus in which knowledge is formed is no longer the pathological garden where God distributed the species, but a generalized medical consciousness, diffused in space and time, open and mobile, linked to each individual existence, as well as to the collective life of the nation, ever alert to the endless domain in which illness betrays, in its various aspects, its great solid form. The years preceding and immediately following the revolution saw the birth of two great myths, with opposing themes and polarities. The myth of a nationalized medical profession, organized like the clergy and invested at the level of man's bodily health, with powers similar to those exercised by the clergy over men's souls, and the myth of a total disappearance of disease in an untroubled, dispassionate society, restored to its original state of health. But we must not be misled by the manifest contradiction of the two themes. Each of these oniric figures expresses, as if in black and white, the same picture of medical experience. The two dreams are isomorphic, the first expressing in a very positive way the strict, militant, dogmatic medicalization of society by way of a quasi-religious conversion and the establishment of a therapeutic clergy. The second expressing the same medicalization, but in a triumphant negative way, that is to say, the volatilization of disease in a corrected, organized, and ceaselessly supervised environment in which medicine itself would finally disappear, together with its object and its raison d'etre. Sabarat de Lavinière, a prolific author of projects in the early years of the Revolution, saw priests and doctors as the natural heirs of the Church's two most visible missions: the consolation of souls and the alleviation of pain. The wealth of the Church, which has been diverted from its original use by the higher clergy, must be confiscated and returned to the nation, which alone knows its own spiritual and material needs. The revenues would not be divided equally between the parish clergy and the doctors. Are not doctors the priests of the body? The soul cannot be considered separately from animate bodies, and if the ministers of the altars are venerated and receive from the state a reasonable living, those who tend your health should also receive a salary sufficient to feed themselves and to succor you. They are the tutelary genii of the integrity of your faculties and sensations. The doctor would no longer have to demand a fee from his patient. The treatment of the sick would be free and obligatory, a service that the nation would provide as one of its sacred tasks. The doctor would be no more than the instrument of that service. At the end of his studies, the new doctor would occupy not the post of his choice, but the one that was assigned to him according to the needs and vacancies throughout the country. When he had gained in experience, he could apply for a more responsible, better paid job. He would have to give an account to his superiors of his activities and would be held responsible for his mistakes. Having become a public, disinterested, supervised activity, medicine could improve indefinitely. In the alleviation of physical misery, it would be close to the old spiritual vocation of the Church, of which it would be a sort of lay carbon copy. To the army of priests watching over the salvation of souls would correspond to that of the doctors, who concern themselves with the health of bodies. The other myth proceeds from a historical reflection carried to its conclusion. Linked as they are with the conditions of existence and with the way of life of individuals, diseases vary from one period and one place to another. In the Middle Ages, at a time of war and famine, the sick were subject to fear and exhaustion, apoplexy, hectic fever. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, a period of relaxation of the feeling for one's country and of the obligations that such a feeling involves, egotism returned, and lust and gluttony became more widespread. Venereal diseases, congestion of the viscera and of the blood. In the 18th century, the search for pleasure was carried over into the imagination. One went to the theater, read novels, and grew excited in vain conversations. One stayed up at night and slept during the day. Hysteria, hypochondria, nervous diseases. A nation that lived without war, without violent passions, without idleness, would know none of these ills, nor, above all, would a nation that did not know the tyranny of wealth over poverty, nor given to abuses. The rich, living in the midst of ease, surrounded by the pleasures of life, their irascible pride, their bitter spleen, their abuses, and the excesses to which their contempt of all principles leads them, makes them prey to infirmities of every kind. Soon their faces are furrowed, their hair turns white, and diseases harvest them before their time. Meanwhile, the poor, subjected to the despotism of the rich and of their kings, know only taxes that reduce them to penury, scarcity that benefits only the profiteers, and unhealthy housing that forces them either to refrain from raising families or to procreate weak, miserable creatures. The first task of the doctor is therefore political. The struggle against disease must begin with a war against bad government. Man will be totally and definitively cured only if he is first liberated. Who then should denounce tyrants to mankind if not the doctors, who make man their sole study, and who each day in the homes of poor and rich, among ordinary citizens, and among the highest in the land, in cottage and mansion, contemplate the human miseries that have no other origin but tyranny and slavery. If medicine could be politically more effective, it would no longer be indispensable medically. And in a society that was free at last, in which inequalities were reduced, and in which concord reigned, the doctor would have no more than a temporary role, that of giving legislator and citizen advice to the regulation of his heart and body. There would no longer be any need for academies and hospitals. By training citizens in frugality by means of simple dietary laws, by showing young people above all the pleasures that may be derived from even a hard life, by making them appreciate the strictest discipline in the Army and Navy, how many ills would be prevented, how much expense avoided, and what new abilities would reveal themselves for the greatest, most difficult enterprises. And gradually, in this young city entirely dedicated to the happiness of possessing health, the face of the doctor would fade, leaving a faint trace in men's memories of a time of kings and wealth, in which they were impoverished, sick, slaves. All this was so much daydreaming, the dream of a festive city inhabited by an open-air mankind, in which youth would be naked and age know no winter, the familiar symbol of ancient Arcadias, to which has been added the more recent theme of a nature encompassing the earliest forms of truth. All these values were soon to fade, and yet they play an important role by linking medicine with the destinies of states. They revealed in it a positive significance. Instead of remaining what it is, the dry, sorry analysis of millions of infirmities, the dubious negation of the negative, it was given the splendid task of establishing in men's lives the positive role of health, virtue, and happiness. It fell to medicine to punctuate work with festivals, to exalt calm emotions, to watch over what was read in books and seen in theaters, to see that marriages were made not out of self-interest, but because of a passing infatuation, but were based on the only lasting condition of happiness, namely, their benefit to the state. Medicine must no longer be confined to a body of techniques for curing ills and of the knowledge that they require. It will also embrace a knowledge of healthy man, that is, a study of non-sick man, and a definition of the model man. In the ordering of human existence, it assumes a normative posture, which authorizes it not only to distribute advice as to healthy life, but also to dictate the standards for physical and moral relations of the individual and of the society in which he lives. It takes its place in that borderline, but for a modern man paramount, area where a certain organic, ruffled, sensory happiness communicates by right with the order of a nation, the vigor of its armies, the fertility of its people, and the patient advance of its labors. The dreamer Latinus gave medicine a definition that was brief but heavy with history. At last, medicine will be what it must be, the knowledge of natural and social man. It is important to determine how and in what manner the various forms of medical knowledge pertained to the positive notions of health and normality. Generally speaking, it might be said that up to the end of the 18th century, medicine related much more to health than to normality. It did not begin by analyzing a regular functioning of the organism and go on to seek where it had deviated, what it was disturbed by, and how it could be brought back into normal working order. It referred rather to qualities of vigor, suppleness, and fluidity, which were lost in illness, and which it was the task of medicine to restore. To this extent, medical practice could accord an important place to regimen and diet, in short, to a whole rule of life and nutrition that the subject imposed upon himself. This privileged relation between medicine and health involved the possibility of being one's own physician. 19th century medicine, on the other hand, was regulated more in accordance with normality than with health. It formed its concepts and prescribed its interventions in relation to a standard of functioning and organic structure and physiological knowledge. Once marginal and purely theoretical knowledge for the doctor was to become established. Claude Bernard bears witness to this at the very center of all medical reflection. Furthermore, the prestige of the sciences of life in the 19th century, their role as model, especially in the human sciences, is linked originally not with the comprehensive, transferable character of biological concepts, but rather with the fact that these concepts were arranged in a space whose profound structure responded to the healthy/morbid opposition. When one spoke of the life of groups and societies, of the life of the race, or even of the psychological life, one did not think first of the internal structure of the organized being, but of the medical bipolarity of the normal and the pathological. Consciousness lives because it can be altered, maimed, diverted from its course, paralyzed,
Societies live because they are sick. Declining societies and healthy, expanding ones. The race is a living being that one can see degenerating in civilizations whose deaths have so often been remarked on are also, therefore, living beings. If the science of man appeared as an extension of the science of life, it is because it was medically as well as biologically based. By transference, importation, and often metaphor, the science of man no doubt used concepts formed by biologists. But the very subjects that it devoted itself to, man, his behavior, his individual and social realizations, therefore opened up a field that was divided up according to the principles of the normal and the pathological. Hence, the unique character of the science of man, which cannot be detached from the negative aspects in which it first appeared, but which is also linked with the positive role that it implicitly occupies as norm. Okay, that's the end of chapter 2 of The Birth of the Clinic by Michel Foucault.